Fratricide, an Amoni-Ram story, Part 2. In the first part of this story, we were introduced to Biliath, a general for the Mechanite Empire who served Kabar, prince and heir to the Fulad throne. Meanwhile, Biliath was in love with Kabar's brother, Ansul, a forbidden romance that would surely get them both tortured and executed as traitors if it were ever discovered. Kabar was directing a siege against a fortified Deva city, but was proving to be immensely barbaric and callous in his leadership, with unrest growing among the soldiers and his generals. One of the generals, Haram, believed that the only real solution was to have Kabar killed, but to do so, he needs to have the cooperation of Biliath, and more importantly, Kabar's own brother. With that, let's pick up where we left off. Chapter 3. Ansul was walking through the markets that morning, another attempt to escape the confines of the apartment, to try and jolt some new inspiration into him with the memory recording machine. He passed by a group of street children, noticing them staring with quiet reverence at his augmentations. They were young, too young to have any augmentations themselves. But even if they did, he was fairly sure they would have still stared. His prosthetics were striking even from a distance. He stopped, kneeling and smiling kindly at them, before introducing himself as Ansul. They exchanged unsure glances, so he told them that it's all right, that they can look. He extended his right arm. One of the children, the youngest it looked like, ran up to him, all fear gone. His friends followed him. Fingers running across the cool Fulad plating, the intricate engravings and designs etched into the gold metal, images of Bumaro I's hammer raised to the heavens, Hashir bringing power to the great city, his own father raising the academy building. Most augmentations were nowhere near this artful, but the royal prostheses were commissioned from the finest craftsmen and artisans of Amoni-Ram, and it showed. The children giggled to themselves as they inspected, whispering that they wanted one just like this when they grew older, and Ansul smiled. Then he saw a shadow fall over them, and turned. It took every ounce of self-control in his body not to wrap Biliath in a bone-snapping embrace when he laid eyes on her, in public as they were. And then he registered the off-balance nature of her glide, the way she listed to her left before jerking herself back on course and coming to a stumbling landing, his brow furrowed with concern. He asked her if she was all right, and she looked up. He could tell she too was exercising all of her restraint as she sunk into a kneel, favoring her left shoulder. She stated that her wings were damaged, although she managed to field repair them somewhat. Her left wing jerked back and forth awkwardly. Some kind of damage to the actuators, probably. So she'd come back for repairs from the one person who knew them best. He nodded, telling her that he'll have a look in his workshop. Biliath lay face down on the rolled-out pad on the floor. Her armor and tunic were stripped away, cast to the corner of the room, and her wings were relaxed and spread, dominating the floor of the apartment. Crouched over her, Ansul was inspecting her back, panels spread open. She heard him let out a soft sigh, and he asked what happened to her. She replied that she was scouting in the air when a lucky shot from a Deva beast, a thorn-wrapped stone, struck her in the wing. She managed to pull herself out of the dive, but landed badly. Her wing twitched, reflexively. He noticed it out of the corner of his eye, but said nothing, instead remarking that at least she isn't hurt. She nodded while trying to stay as still as possible. The slightest wrong movement could split a wire or sever an actuator, leaving her worse off than when she'd started. Maintenance and repairs were always an intimate thing. Soldiers would form lifelong bonds with the combat mechanics that set to work repairing their arms, legs, and eyes after injuries. But Biliath's augmentations were too rare, too complex for an average Legion mechanic. She knew how to repair most of her components herself, but the positioning of her wings demanded another person, so she came to the one person who knew them best. Leaning over her back, Ansul clucked and made small noises as he inspected the damage. He reached a finger in, teasing one wire gently. Biliath whimpered a bit, soft, electric buzzing numbing the muscles of her back, and then it shorted, making her left wing flap wildly and sending a contraption crashing to the floor, where it shattered into a half-dozen pieces. Her face fell, and she reached out, grabbing the chunks. She apologized and began inspecting the pieces, seeing their attachments and screws, seeing how they clicked and fit together, flesh and foulard fingers scraping the surface and nooks and crannies. Ansul shook his head with a smile, telling her that it wasn't her fault, as it wasn't working very well anyway. She asked what it was, and he replied that it's a smaller version of the memory scribes. If they worked, you'd be able to use them to transcribe memories to the cylinders they could read later. He asks her to take a crack at it later, as she always had a better eye for such things than he did. She responds by asking what he's talking about, as there's so many inventions here, but he counters by remarking on how many of them function, and how many don't. It took him years of study at the academy to get to where he is, and he still struggles. And then there's her. He gently plucked the machine out of her hands. It was in one piece again, clicked and screwed and wired back together in a matter of seconds. Biliath replies that she was just fiddling with it, and Ansul says that he knows, as she has an instinct for technology that can't be taught. She would have made a fine addition to the academy. She says, in another life maybe, with both of them ignoring the fact that Haith had long since barred women from being members of the academy. Biliath grunted as another shock ran through her muscles, and she asked how bad it was. Ansul sighed, lifting his goggles up, replying that it's not good. The actuators on the left side are all shorted and will need replacing, and of course the foulard feathers that are dented or crumpled will need to be reforged and hammered out. She then asked how long that will take, as Ansul passed her back her tunic and armor. She slipped into it, as familiar as a second skin. Ansul smiled, stating a few days at least, but that's a few more days spent together, although she didn't return the smile, her eyes lost somewhere else. He asked her what was wrong, and a voice inside her demanded that she tell him, but she instead blinked it away. She smiled back at him and answered nothing. They wasted the rest of the day cavorting around Amoni-Ram. Biliath's wings were too damaged for aerial maneuvers and long flights, but they were still intact enough to glide out of the apartment window, even carrying another person's weight. They landed in a quiet alley in the southern quarter and donned rough, unobtrusive cloaks over their clothing. Ansul left his earrings and nose ring in the apartment, and for a day they could walk around Amoni-Ram, free of the Imperial Guard, free of prying eyes. They explored the spice market, inspecting the mountains of deep red and lilac spices from the farthest reaches of the Empire, watching the hawkers shovel them into clay pots for the greedy outstretched arms of housewives and traders. Ansul scrounged a few coins from his pocket and paid for a basket of fresh figs and dates and apples. They ate from it until they were both full and their hands were sticky with juice from the figs, and left the rest of it for the street children to devour hungrily. Biliath watched him smile at the children encouragingly. He said to her that this is the greatest city of the grandest empire. No child should have to go hungry. His gaze fell on the soldiers patrolling through the market behind the scene. They walked under the shadow of the Great Wall of Amoni-Ram, an ever-popular spot for young couples. Most much younger than them, but a man and a woman on a romantic walk was hardly a thing of note, and so they walked until the heat became too much and they took a seat against the cool stone of the wall, hands intertwined. They passed through a tea shop, taking sips from small cups with tea so strong it made Biliath gag and Ansul laugh. They drifted to a hashish den, the degenerate establishments which had always existed but had only now begun to proliferate, returning soldiers looking for something to numb the pain, and the palace looking for new sources of taxation. Smoke-filled rooms with cushions and low tables and the bubbling of pipes, strangers leaning into each other's shoulders. Ansul partook a bit, laughing with the party of strangers he had sat down with, and Biliath over his shoulder keeping an eye on him. And the whole day, whenever Ansul shot a passing glance at his quiet love when she didn't realize he was looking, he saw a darkened shadow hanging across her face. She broke the silence later that evening, when they were both lying in bed together, exhausted, sheets wrapped around their bare legs, panting from the exertion slowly fading to normal breathing. She tells him that she lied to him earlier about how she hurt herself, but he replies simply that he knows, as her wing twitches when she lies. She asks why he didn't say anything, to which he says that he thought she'd tell him when she was ready. He shrugged, and somewhere deep in her chest, encased in foulade, her heart melted. She explains that it wasn't a battle. She was flying back to the siege after visiting him, and then suddenly there was smoke in her nose and in the air, and she couldn't breathe, and she went crashing down to earth, landing hard on her wing and shoulder. He asks if she thought he'd think less of her for an accident, but she says that it wasn't that. She went quiet for a second, before saying that she landed in a mass grave. Hundreds of her men's bodies doused in oils, burning, flesh charring and crisping. Her voice caught at the end, and his stomach turned. He tells her that he's sorry she had to see that, as the Deva are inhuman beasts. Biliath sat up next to him, piercing eyes staring at him, as she told him that it wasn't the Deva, it was his brother. His blood ran cold as she continued. He ordered her units into a charge through a flooding river, which was pointless suicide, but he still gave the order. They said they wouldn't go without their commander, without her, so he set the Imperial Guard on them, put them to the sword, made them kneel, and then he gave the decimation order. There was a sinking feeling in his stomach, and he asked what that is. She explained that it's a field punishment for mutinous troops. Every unit selects one man amongst themselves and kills him, slits his throat like a dog. And then he had them stripped of their augmentations and their bodies burned. He wanted them marked as traitors to the Empire, because they wouldn't kill themselves without her to lead them into the fire. Ansul is incredulous, but she cuts him off, telling him that Kabar admitted it to her. He didn't give a damn, it was nothing to him. He ordered the deaths of 200 of her men as easily as Ansul purchased that basket of dates. An exchange, blood for obedience. Ansul was up now, staring at the wall silently. She pressed the opportunity, telling him to sit down and calling him her lord. He replied no, and to not call him that. She reached a hand out, grasping his and pulling him back onto the mattress. She inhaled, and then leapt before she lost her nerve, telling him that the discontent among the officers has escalated now. She was approached by some of them, and they know about the two of them. Suddenly, time seemed to slow for Ansul. Everything felt glacial, heavy, like pushing through honey. It took a monumental effort to say the next word. How? She explained that they have spies in the city, and they weren't careful enough. They're threatening to expose them to the guard, to Kabar, if she doesn't help them. He asks her what they want her to do, to which she says, prepare him to take the throne before Kabar can. He breathed heavily for a few seconds before speaking, telling her to give him their names. He'll have them charged with treason, She inhaled again, refusing, and Ansul tells her that she doesn't have to be afraid of them, as mutiny in the ranks is nothing novel. She, however, replies that she's not afraid of them, and in fact, she agrees with them. Time resumed its normal pace, and Ansul snapped his neck around. She tells him that his brother is a madman, and she's held her tongue for a long time, but this is too far. This is unforgivable. If he's allowed to take the throne when their father passes, the Empire is doomed. Amoni-Ram will not survive his rule. She will not survive his rule, and Ansul may not either. Ansul responded, his voice steadily rising, telling her that this is sedition and he won't allow it. He demands that she give him the names of these generals, but she hissed at him, sudden fire in her voice, telling him that he's not in a position to demand anything from her. The two glared at each other across the bed, and she'd never seen him enraged before. He asks what happens then. She protects her co-conspirators while they make plans to kill his brother in the street, but she replies that there doesn't need to be blood. Kabar doesn't have to die, although she thinks to herself that he certainly deserves to. This gives Ansul pause, and he tells her to explain, pinching the bridge of his nose and turning to the wall. She tells him that she doesn't know the full details, but they say that it will not involve death unless Ansul makes it so. She was glad he was turned away, so he couldn't see her wing twitch. They just want him prepared to assume the Fulad throne on a moment's notice, to ensure the Empire is never without an emperor. In spite of the situation, he scoffed, saying that it might as well be. She continued, insisting that that was part of the problem. Kabar was somewhat restrained when their father was still around, but with him gone, Kabar has no one left to control him. She wasn't wrong, as he hadn't been like this 10 years ago. He was still hot-headed and aggressive, but that was just how he was. He'd never progressed to anything truly awful. Nothing like this. Ansul counters that he doesn't want the throne. He's not a ruler, he never wanted to be, and never pretended to be. Biliath tells him to look at her, and reluctantly he dragged his gaze up to meet hers. She asks him if he thinks, in his heart of hearts, that Amoni-Ram will survive the reign of terror Kabar will bring. His throat tightened as a flood of memories rushed through his head. Kabar brusquely telling off their mother for her counsel, insisting that he was the Shahal, not her. Kabar shoving one of the visiting Shahs to the ground over a perceived slight to his honor. Kabar at his father's side, overseeing the mass beheadings of the rebels from Ul-Maram. He was silent for a moment. He finally responds, telling her to please leave, causing her heart to sink. She tries to argue, but he repeats it, saying that he needs to think right now. She slipped off the mattress, gathering her things. Then she stood, turning to him. She tells him that she will not do anything without him at her side. If he can match her gaze, and tell her that he believes the Empire will survive Kabar on the throne, she will put an end to this right now. If they tell the guard, and the two of them have to flee this city, she will do it at his side. She is his. She stood, waiting for an answer, until he nodded. He tells her that he is hers, and she has his silence, but he just needs to be alone. Biliath slipped into the garrison, offering a token salute to the surprised night guards manning the gate. They hurriedly let her through, and she passed through the plaza, now bereft of soldiers in formation or drilling. Just a wide-open, empty space. The main garrison building had a few chambers in the rear for generals temporarily without accommodation, which, she supposed, included her tonight. Malene unlocked the door with a heavy brass key, eyes still bleary, and he remarks that they weren't expecting her. She replies that she thought she would have other arrangements tonight, but he just says that it's no trouble, and she should get some rest, as it looks like she could use it. She nodded, thanked him, slipped inside, and locked the door behind her. It was a simple, clean chamber. A soft bed, a desk, a wash basin, and a window looking out over the plaza. Sterile, military, without any character or personality, warmth, or homeliness. She dropped her things in the corner, stripped off her armor, and fell into the bed. The room felt awfully cold. The next evening, Ansul's bed lay empty. The prince strode briskly through the streets, rubbing his golden eyes and tightening his robe. It was the small hours of the night, before the sun had risen, and the only people in the streets were the Nighthawks, drinking their tea and admiring the hashish-fueled illusion of the Prince of Amoni-Ram being led through the city by a servant. Larat explained apologetically to the prince that he wouldn't have woken him if he hadn't had to, referring to him as his lord. Ansul didn't even have the brainpower to tell him off for the honorific, and simply groaned in response. His contingent of the Imperial Guard flanked the pair, and their formation moved briskly through the streets in the direction of the palace. Night in Amoni-Ram was a beautiful thing. At sunrise, the dying rays would set the towers alight in gold, and that sheen would fade for the next hour as the city drifted into darkness. And then the power conduits would be flipped, and the high posts at each corner would buzz to life, casting a glimmering yellow-white light over the streets. The merchants would activate their own small lights for the customers who came in late. Most people would wander to their homes. Amoni-Ram was never truly empty, but in these hours, it was the closest it would ever come to being unoccupied. No massive crowds, just people. Ansul flashed his face to the palace guard, who let his party in. They moved across the courtyard, slipping into the interior maze of the palace. Ansul asked Larat where she is, to which he replied, the throne room. The guard have sealed the room, but a small crowd of courtiers is forming outside. Ansul sighed, stating that they ought to take the servants' corridors. This was a practiced affair for him, and they moved through the tight corridors, ignoring the watchful eyes on them, left and right, until they found themselves at a small side door. Ansul turned to his friend and his guards, telling them to stay here. They nodded, and he slipped inside alone. The throne room of the Grand Palace of Amoni-Ram was a staggering sight to an outsider. A vast, wide-open space, high dome overhead, its interior lined with gold and red and blue tilework and mosaics depicting the Empire's rise. 20 men could stand shoulder to shoulder and fit comfortable inside the massive dome. Below, huge fabric veils hung, stretching from one side of the room to the other to offer shade when the roof was open in the winter months. The floor was intricately made with overlapping and interlocking tiles of ceramic and steel in a knotted, infinitely complex pattern, and Ansul's feet clicked across them as he approached the Fulad throne, and his mother lounging in it. He greeted her, and she finally noticed him, eyes glazed over. She slurred the words in her return greeting, and Ansul quietly noted the empty bottle sitting next to the throne. He asked her what she was doing, in as gentle a tone as he could muster, and she giggled, curling up in the embrace of the throne. It didn't dwarf her as much as he expected it to. She replied that she was taking her place, before saying that she never wanted this. She waved a hand vaguely across the throne room, and explained that his father took the throne early, barely a boy, so she was barely a girl. She must have been 15 when they wedded. Ansul frowned, as he didn't know that, and he ran some numbers in his head. She would have been 30 when she had him, and he asks why she waited. She snorted in response and said there was no waiting, not by choice. A pit began to form in Ansul's stomach as she continued. She was a girl, not a woman. She had barely lived. She had no idea who she was. Why would she want to throw away her life to be the caged bird in a faraway palace? No, it wasn't fun. Not at first. She wouldn't have it, but his father is his father. Stubborn. She trailed off into silence before speaking again, stating that he wanted her and decided he would have her. Ansul replies that he thought she and him loved each other, but she shrugs, stating that men love the idea of them, of having them. Children don't need to know about the troubles of their parents. Ansul and Kabar didn't need to know about the beatings and the threats. The pit grew larger in his stomach, and he asks about the beatings. She explains that she spent a year in Amoni-Ram's dungeons, making her into his perfect wife, with chains and razors. She raised her left hand, showing her middle finger of foulade, and she states that not all augmentations show devotion. Ansul begins to stutter about what he thought, but she interrupts him, asking if he thought his father was a good man. She scoffed, wine drunk, and says that the Emperor is his father, and his father before him, taking and taking and taking. They like to possess, like to have. They like their empires vast and women quiet. Haith, Kabar, Ansul. And now she sits here, and he rots in his bed. Ansul asks her why, and the question seemed to catch her off guard. He asks why stay and rule in his stead. He's feeble, infirm, and utterly dependent on her. She could walk away. She replies that she doesn't stay for him. She stays for the Empire. It needs a leader, even if he lies brain dead while she whispers edicts in his ear. Ansul states that manipulating the Emperor is sedition, and she suddenly hissed at him. She is doing what she can to preserve this collapsing house. She controls the nobles. Haram keeps a hold on the Legion, and Ansul's presence unifies the people and the clergy. They can only hold the throne and kneel and pray Kabar's son is better than his father. Ansul remarks that he thought she had faith in him, to which she says that she loves him more than Ansul could ever love anyone, but she looks at him and all she can see is their father's eyes, without restraint. She smiles sadly. He will do all his father did and more. He will hurt people because they aren't what he wants them to be, and she still loves him, despite it all. She cannot stop loving him, so she will not be able to stop him. The only thing that she can do is go down to the temple in the night and kneel and quietly pray to Meccain that he doesn't come home through no fault of hers. Then she rose unsteadily, shakily descending the steps from the dais until she was inches away from him. The stench of drink was heavy on her breath, and she raised a hand, patting it against his cheek. She tells him that she wants him to marry. She wants him to find a girl and to marry before she's gone. He's good, and he's not like his brother or father yet. She won't let him be. So if he hurts her, she'll kill him. He didn't speak as he guided her to the side entrance to the throne room, and Larat sheepishly turned his face away. Ansul told the guard to escort her to her quarters and seal the doors behind her, letting her sleep it off. Also, disperse the crowd outside, and tell them it was Ansul. They bowed, guiding the Empress away, and he and Larat watched them go, stink of alcohol fading with her. Ansul stated lamely that she's not well, to which Larat shrugged and asked who of them is. She's lucky to have him, at any rate, to step up when she can't. He speaks with a born authority. Ansul replies that he doesn't like to, but Larat tells him that those who do rarely should. He asks if he should walk him back to his apartment, but Ansul sighed. He'd barely slept before the guard had woken him, assaulted by fragmented dreams. The night before had been completely sleepless. He was tired enough to collapse right there on the floor. He tells Larat that he doesn't think he'll make it back, and the man nods, stating that he'll have them prepare his old chambers, just for the night. Ansul begins to protest, but Larat cuts him off, telling him that it's either that or in the stables with the horses. Ansul laughs and agrees. Biliath swooped down to a landing on the roof of the tower. The sun was setting in the distance, and Ansul was sitting on the flat roof, eyes closed. He didn't turn as she approached and took a seat next to him, not quite touching. They watched the sun cast the city aflame. She finally commented on the city's beauty, but Ansul replied and says that the first time he saw her, he was 17. His father was in the last stages of his illness, and General Malin wanted him and Kabar acquainted with the military command. He brought them to the garrison, introduced them to the various high generals. Himself, Haram, Uthram, and her. He doesn't think she even noticed him at the time, as he barely spoke. He had no interest in military affairs, and he let Kabar do all of the glad-handing, but from the second he laid eyes on her, he knew that she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. She responds quietly, telling him that she noticed him and thought the same. He was glad the setting sun hid his blush as he continued. It took him another 5 years to say anything, because he was so terrified of hurting his brother, taking what was his. The guilt of just wanting her ate him up inside, and so he tried not seeing her. He never went to the garrison. He left the palace, and still she infested his thoughts until he couldn't bear it anymore. If he was going to feel guilty, he might as well live deliciously for it. Her hand snaked on top of his, and he didn't pull it away. She tells him that she's glad he did, but he says that he never wanted to hurt Kabar, as he loves him. She asks if he thinks that he'll stay his hand the same if he finds out about them, but Ansul shook his head. He'll have them tortured and executed, because he took what was his. But Ansul doesn't love people because they'll love him back. He just loves them, and it's more than that anyway. The Empire needs a leader. Kabar, for all his talents, can't lead, and Ansul doesn't want to. He laughed, remarking on what a sorry state of affairs it is. Biliath tells him that he can't run away from what he has to do, and Ansul replies that that's what people keep telling him. He asks how her friends plan to avoid a civil war, as Kabar won't just stand down, and 2 princes claiming the throne is asking for war. She says that she'll ask them when she returns to the siege camp, so he says that they'd best get her wings fixed quickly. She replies that they can afford a few more minutes. He nodded, and she curled into his shoulder as they watched the sun dip below the horizon. Eventually, Ansul states that he'll do it, assume the throne, if he has to. He just doesn't want to hurt Kabar, and that's all he asks. She replies by saying that he won't have to, but her wing twitched, and they both pretended not to notice it. There was a wretched air in the camp when she returned. She landed late, near dusk, just as the sun had been swallowed up by the jungle around the city. The dotted lights of the vast camp cut through the brush, and she quickly made her way over. The soldiers greeted her with stiff salutes and nods. Distantly, the steady boom-boom of the artillery sounded out over the camp. It made for an odd rhythm. Soldiers, so used to the barrage, would naturally pause a moment before, hear the distantly deafening thump, and then resume conversation like nothing had happened. Every so often, a screaming hiss would sound out as the Deva returned fire, and those closest to the city would dive into their trenches and under cover. The rest simply waited for it to pass. Under the cover of one of the artillery barrages, she heard something. A scream, sharp and loud, cutting across the air of the camp. From the charges, maybe? She froze, waiting to hear another noise, but nothing came, and none of the soldiers seemed to register it. After a few seconds, she carried on. Perhaps her imagination. She found Haram outside the command tent, taking quick sips from a flask. She raised an eyebrow at it as he tucked it back inside his breastplate. He assures her that it's tea and motioned her inside. She ducked into the tent and immediately straightened as she realized they weren't alone. 5 lieutenants, all wearing the colors of Haram's legion, standing around the command tent. She looked at him, and he tells her to speak freely, as they're trustworthy. He commands one to watch the door, and the rest just watched as Biliath approached the map table. She asks if anything happened while she was away, but he says no. Kabar made a mistake the last time, and he knows it. Their soldiers despise him now, and doing it again would risk open rebellion from his forces. They're loyal to them now, not Kabar. He then asks where they are with Ansul, and she replies that he's open to the idea of assuming the throne, if they can arrange it. A collective breath was released from around the room, and Haram says that that's very good, but asks if it's that easy. Biliath then explains that she told him that his brother wouldn't be harmed, causing a sharp inhale. Haram tells her that that's not how this plays out, and this plan doesn't work with him still alive. She asks why not, and he explains that Kabar has lost the support of the Legion, of the clergy, and of the people, but he retains key supporters among the governors and nobles. That, crossed with his parentage, is enough to support a legitimate grab for the throne, and he's a petulant, juvenile child. He will never, ever accept being ousted, not like this, not by his younger brother. As long as he draws breath, they'd be tempting civil war. She replies that it took a lot for Ansul to even consider taking the throne, and she got them there. Now they're asking her to push him to murder. Haram says that he's asking her to show him what needs to be done. He doesn't need to remind her what happens if she can't. She tells him to just give her time, causing the lieutenants to exchange glances. She asks what's going on, and Haram tells her that the situation has changed. They've learned that the Deva's defense is on the verge of collapse, although they're not sure how. Kabar's lieutenants seem sure of it, more sure than they've ever been. They know something the rest of them don't, maybe a weak point, and they're planning a large push in a week or two. A week out from the end of the longest siege in the history of the Legion. The prospect was like a shot in the arm, and Biliath asks why that's a bad thing. He replies that if Kabar takes the city before she can prepare Ansul, then he'll return to Amoni-Ram and be coronated. She realizes that they'll never get another opportunity. They need her here when they pierce their defenses, but after that, he thinks that he can get her sent back to Amoni-Ram as an advance party. She'll have to ready Ansul then, and there is no other option. She let out a soft hiss of air, and remarks that she's not even sure if she's ready. Haram tells her that she has to be, as does Ansul. This is too tight a window for error. He was hoping that Ansul would be ready now, but that was foolhardy. Biliath replies that he's not like them, he's not a killer, but Haram says that emperors must understand how to take a life. When he is on that throne, Then Haram can rest. Until then, keep on as she is. Allow no one to suspect anything is amiss, least of all the dog. He must feel as safe as a lamb until the knife is being dragged across his throat. In Kabar's tent, he states that his pretty little bird returns and says that she took her blessed time in Amoni-Ram. Biliath replies that Prince Ansul needed to acquire the parts to repair her wing, and she apologizes. He nods, easing into his seat, and asks how his brother is doing. He loves the boy, and it's best that he stays behind the safety of the city walls. For a moment, she thought she saw something unfamiliar in Kabar's eyes, a sheen of sincere wistfulness, maybe. There was a commotion in the far corner of the tent, and Biliath turned just in time to see two members of the Imperial Guard leaving, carrying a body between them. The body of a Deva boy, bleeding from the mouth, skin marred by cuts and bruises and burns, face half transformed between man and beast, rich brown eyes, the same eyes Biliath had seen at the end of a collar being pulled towards this side of the camp so many weeks ago. Even from this distance, with the half-second glance, Biliath could tell the child was dead. Time seemed to slow, and she barely registered Kabar's voice addressing her. Kabar explained that he was a Deva assassin that had snuck into his tent in the dead of night while she was away. He tried to sink a knife into his chest, but his guard managed to capture him. He remarks that her duties falter, and he wonders if she's not better served in a non-combat role with the other women. The boy's body was frail, emaciated. She would have been surprised if he had the strength to draw a blade, much less use it. What didn't surprise her were the jagged wounds, sure to never heal right, the meticulously applied burns, signs of slow, methodical torture. Kabar continues, stating that it's quite depraved of them to use their children for such things, but he was old enough to hold a blade. He decided that the boy was old enough to be interrogated, and he gave up some useful information before he wore out. A corpse being dragged from the Shahal's tent. The scream she had heard over and over from the far side of the camp, dismissed as her imagination. She knew how Kabar had his information on the teetering defense now. He simply plucked the only people in the city not zealous enough in their spirit to ignore the agony of their flesh. Children. This was beyond depraved. This was monstrous. Even in wartime, there had to be boundaries, and this was far, far beyond those boundaries. Biliath raised her eyes. Kabar matched her gaze, daring her to say something, relishing the thrill. He was pushing her, she realized, seeing how far his bird's loyalty really went, how much she would tolerate in the name of duty. Her hand closed around the hilt of her sword, and her muscles tightened to make the lunge, one thought running through her head. He dies for this. He dies for this. Then there was a strong hand on her shoulder, pulling her back and weighing her down. Haram's gauntlet, his eyes locked with hers. He said nothing, but the message was clear. Safe as a lamb, until the knife is being dragged across his throat. Every single instinct in her screamed to leap and pierce his chest with her blade, to deliver some meager justice for the corpse being dragged outside the tent. Damn the cost. Damn however much blood needed to be spilled to balance the scales. And then she remembered the 200 bodies burning in that field so many weeks ago, and the expectant eyes of her men as she swore on their memories. Never again. Her white-knuckle grip on her sword slowly eased, and she felt herself drift away, watching the scene from outside as something else took control, moving her muscles and speaking in her voice, and she stated simply that it won't happen again. Kabar tells her to see that it doesn't, and dismisses her. And then she was leaving the tent and walking away, and Haram was walking briskly after her, calling her name as she ignored him, pushing through the crowd of soldiers, leaving the camp behind as she approached the field of bodies, casting her gaze across them until she found what she knew she'd find. The body of the Deva, twisted and mangled, tossed onto the heap of the thousands already dead. Haram came up next to her, remarking that he was a child, an innocent, and Biliath didn't lift her gaze. She felt her soul ease back into her body, stomach twisted with bitter rage, and she replies that they always seem to lose the most. Haram tells her that Kabar deserves to face justice for this, so Biliath asks why he stayed her blade. It wasn't a question, not really, as both of them knew the answer, but Haram answered anyways. He tells her that there's no justice to be found here, none they can deliver without getting themselves and 1,000 other men killed in the process. He asks who's going to deliver their justice, but she didn't have an answer. He continued, stating that the Shahal's justice is at the bottom of a cup of tea shared with his brother in Amoni-Ram. But Biliath replies that his brother is an innocent as well. Haram states that he knows, and he's been thinking about that while she was gone. He's changed his mind. She doesn't have to convince him if she doesn't want to, as he'll do it himself. He said it so even-handedly that it took a second for it to register. She whipped her neck around and says that Haram said that the Imperial Guard would immediately know that they'd fall upon his army. Thousands would die, and certainly him. Haram agrees that they probably would, and he probably will. Still, it's a risk he's prepared to take, to stay Kabar from the throne. She asks why he had a sudden change of heart, to which he says that too much innocence has been lost already. They both stared at the Deva boy's mangled body. He won't allow Kabar to compromise his own honor and to force her into an impossible choice. He respects her too much for that, so at least he'll die with his integrity. He spoke of his own death so casually, the tone one might take for a bargain found at the market. That's what this was for him. Cost and benefit. Him and maybe thousands of their men dead, just to kill Kabar. But she had a way to kill him with no other casualties. She told him bluntly that chances are he'll fail, and besides, it's too late. He was right the first time, that she can't protect Ansul forever. Haram pointed out gently that he's the only one in that palace with a clean conscience, and asks if she's sure she'll still love him once she strips that away. Biliath asks herself if she's sure that he'll still love her, and she was still looking into those rich brown eyes, now bereft of any life behind them, as she replies that war makes bastards of us all. Chapter 4. Haram's words proved prophetic. Tom Brat's walls fell a week later. She was in the air the evening it happened, soaring high above the city, scouting it out. The sound was deafening, nearly knocking her out of the air, and when she regained control, she banked and laid her eyes on what they had been sat waiting nearly a year for, the southern wall of Tom Brat, lying blown apart and aflame from a single well-placed artillery shot that had hit a reserve of flammable oil within, as if they had known exactly where it was. The city lay like a wounded animal on its side, soft flank entirely exposed. The cathartic scream she let out was only heard by the birds, and then they too were gone, left behind as she dived towards the city. Flood of mechanized soldiers underneath her charging through the gap in the wall, following their commander screaming into the maw of hell. Tom Brat stood in the space between two rivers, due far north of Mamjul. Whoever controlled the city controlled the rivers, and whoever controlled the rivers could move troops closer to the Deva capital than anyone had ever come before. And so the Deva had been the first to conquer it so many centuries ago, and it had stood as a bastion of protection for their traders and farmers and wandering ascetics since. Man-made cuttings from the rivers flowed through the city itself, bringing fresh water under the walls. Tom Brat fell in the space between two rivers, forced to kneel after a year of siege by the Golden Legion. For 5 days and 5 nights they looted the city, taking with them its priceless treasures, and no prisoners. The Deva ran routed, the swords of the Legion falling on them without mercy. The symphony of artillery was replaced by screaming until the last Deva priestess died, and the commander sank to her knees, washing her face in the river running red with blood, asking a silent goddess for forgiveness for what she had done, what she had yet to do. Biliath was in a room in the citadel, smooth stone walls packed with priceless artworks and gems, probably the bedchambers of some priestess or governor. There was a bloody stain on the mattress, but she tried not to look at it. She turned as one of the soldiers stuck his head through the doorway, panting, and called out to her. He informs her that Prince Kabar is demanding to address the officers. She asks where Haram is, but he doesn't know, as Kabar asked for her. Biliath nodded, following after him. They marched quickly through the citadel. It had the heavy gray stone construction the Deva loved, interspersed with thick vines as hard as any foulad. Most of it had been looted, but they had yet to install their own command structure inside to hold the city. Haram would be in charge, no doubt. The soldiers were already calling it his victory, his achievement, which she was fine with. There was no arguing that he'd given up the most to ensure this victory. That it would go next to his name in the histories felt like adequate payment. His first command would be rebuilding the shattered wall, of course, but she would get to that once she saw what petulant demand Kabar was. Her stomach dropped when she saw him, in the central courtyard surrounded by the Imperial Guard and crowds of muttering soldiers, with a figure bound and kneeling next to him. Haram. Kabar clapped as she approached, and she asked what this was. He drew his blade and pointed it at Haram, stating that this is a traitor. Biliath narrowed her eyes and asked what he was talking about. Kabar waved his blade in the air as he spoke, explaining that for the past 3 months, General Haram has had contacts inside the walls of Tom Brat, feeding them knowledge of where their forces would strike, and when, so that they could be more easily repelled. The muttering from the soldiers increased in intensity, and Kabar continued. He states that Haram has done this because he lost faith in their strength. He began to believe that Tom Brat's walls would not fall, that they would eventually be exhausted and forced to slink back to Amoni-Ram with their tails between their legs, and was buying his own position high in the upper echelons of the Deva. He calls him a most vile kind of traitor, that who would sell out his own troops for his own neck. He draped the tip of the blade gently across Haram's throat. That was impossible, as Haram's plan rested entirely on Tom Brat falling in the next week. It made no sense that he would have been cooperating with the Deva, and staring at Kabar's golden eyes, she could see that even he did not believe what he was saying. Haram spat, telling Kabar that he remains as stupid as he is barbaric, and the flat of the blade came around, striking him in the back of the head. He tells Haram to be quiet, as he has given up the lives of countless men to secure his own legacy. With a sinking feeling in her stomach, Biliath realized they had both made a crucial error. They had underestimated their quarry. They had taken Kabar for an impatient fool, unskilled in the arts of war, only capable of the most direct, brutish charges. That he didn't notice or care about the massive loss of life he was absorbing, and assumed himself insulated from any consequences. But now, looking at his golden eyes relishing in Haram's misery, she could see they had been fatally incorrect. This was it, the masterstroke. In one fell swoop, Kabar had assured his legacy. The siege had taken so long and been so catastrophic because of a single traitorous general, not because of the prince. His strongest political enemy was to be executed in the manner of traitors, securing his command and rule. Haram's name would be stricken from the record, the victory of Tom Brat being attributed to Crown Prince Kabar instead. And the no-quarter order meant that not a single Deva was left alive to gainsay the accusation. The dog had been hunting them too, she realized, and they had wandered blindly into his trap. Her throat tightened, and her hand fell on the grip of her sword, taking a step forward. Then she stopped at the slight, almost imperceptible shake of Haram's head. Invisible, unless she had been looking for it. He matched her gaze. No, you cannot allow yourself to be found out. She suppressed the urge, but Kabar noticed the step, asking if she's eager for justice. He tells her that she'll have her chance, but for now, he asks Haram if he has anything to say in his defense. Haram raised his head. Even now, kneeling, he had a strong, proud air about him. This was a man of honor, and Kabar's pitiful attempts to bring him low could not rob that from him. Haram states that his accusations are false, meant only to pad himself as the taker of Tom Brat. Kill him if he wants, if it brings his rotten soul some momentary peace. He cannot change reality, that he is a stupid child, and the blood shed here drenches his hands, not Haram's. The foot came around from the left, kicking Haram in the jaw and sending him sprawling. Kabar says that he will not be condescended to by a traitor. He finds him guilty of high treason, and he will be executed in the manner of traitors. He looked around before saying that this is no court of rubies, but it will have to do. Biliath never saw a flash of fear cross Haram's eyes, not even for a second. He never dropped his gaze, not as Kabar stepped away and 4 members of the Imperial Guard approached, one grasping each limb and raising him into the air. Even as he screamed, shrieking as the connection between flesh and metal gave way, blood leaking from the gaps between his stumps and his prosthetics, and his soldiers pushed forward against the line of Imperial Guardsmen, shouting. Even as his screaming was replaced by the screaming of metal as the foulade gave way, limbs shearing off, and blood spraying onto the stone as he fell to the ground, writhing in agony. His screams rising over the shouting from his officers. Every movement sprayed more ruby-red blood onto the ground, mixing with the leaking oil from his prosthetics, a pool of fluids to die in. Then Kabar's voice rose over his agonized screaming, telling him that he will lie here, taking hours to die. Or he would, if Kabar were not an honorable master. In respect to his years of service, he will grant one mercy, a quick death. Then he turned to Biliath, telling her to cut his throat and put an end to his traitorous life. She froze. Haram was still screaming, writhing limbless on the ground, dying. It was over for him. He'd lost too much blood already. He would not survive this. A quick death was, indeed, the only mercy she could grant him now. You cannot allow yourself to be found out. And so, all her officers staring, she choked down the bitter, incandescent rage at this monster, this wretch, and nodded, taking a shaky step forward, hand drawing a dagger from her belt loop. The same dagger she had thought about cutting Haram with so many weeks ago, but now he was not threatening her. His eyes were matching her gaze, somehow cutting through the unimaginable pain. She approached, kneeling gently, as he gurgled, throat filling with his own blood. For the living and the dead, never again. She placed the edge of the knife against his throat. Kabar announced for Haram to state his last words, and Haram said them so softly, so quietly, that only Biliath, cradling his head in her lap, could have heard him. He said simply that he dies for his empire, and she dragged the knife across his throat while she held his head, safe like a lamb, and eventually he stopped moving, proud nose up, no honor behind those eyes, nothing at all. She let Haram's head drop to the stones. Kabar approached from behind. She didn't have to restrain herself from cutting his throat out. Her muscles were too exhausted to raise herself up. His fingers teased her hair, and he tells her to fly back to Amoni-Ram and tell them of her master's victory and to prepare for his return. He will re-enter not as a prince, but as an emperor. She felt herself nodding dimly, then rising to her feet, stumbling back into the citadel, into the room she had taken as hers. Pulling the box from under a shelf, unclasping it, removing Ansul's memory machine, now clicking and whirring and functioning perfectly. She set it down on the stone slab and placed her fingers into the slots, and thought of Haram. The walls of Amoni-Ram held 4 gates, one in every cardinal direction, each as tall as 20 men. They were as strong and thick as the walls that held them, capable of being barred with hydraulic locks in case the city were ever besieged. But of course, that was impossible, because the enemy would never reach Amoni-Ram. The eastern gate was gargantuan. Moving it by hand was an impossibility, and so it relied on a huge mechanical coil and pulley that inched back agonizingly slowly, pulling the huge doors apart while Ansul watched. When the gap was wide enough to fit several men, he advanced, Imperial Guard forming a protective diamond around him. There was an organized force waiting outside the gates, stretching far back, and with one person at its head. All the caution in his form evaporated upon seeing who led the formation. He ordered his guard back, rushing ahead into the cool night. He called out to Biliath, who sank into a kneel, and he remarked on her returning early, hopefully with good news. He looked around her unit, a relatively small force, just a few hundred troops, some of them mounted, surrounding the train of some 15 land crossers, the wide, many-legged cargo vessels. They weren't in marching formation, he realized. There was a pattern to their positioning, but not one he knew. Biliath's voice was flat and emotionless as she responded, telling him that Tom Brat has fallen, and they've occupied the city in the name of the Emperor. Ansul felt a knot in his shoulder relax as he asked what all this was then. Biliath replied with, "The cost," and the words dripped with a fury and bitterness that he'd never heard in her voice before. Then she turned, shouting an order. One of the land crossers backed up, presenting its cargo doors. They were yanked open, and Ansul caught a glance of what was inside. Stacked coffins. His heart sank as he asked if these were the victims of the Deva. Biliath shook her head as she stepped inside and dragged one of the coffins out herself. It scraped against the packed sand as she brought it before her prince and began undoing the lid. She informed him that no, the Deva killed thousands more than this. These are just his brother's victims. She pulled off the lid, and his breath caught as he looked upon the corpse of General Haram. His skin was pale, dried brown blood staining the underside of his neck where his throat had been cut. His prosthetics had been sheared off, the metal twisted and fragmented, but lovingly lashed back to his limbs. General Haram, who had practically lived in the palace when his father first fell sick, supporting his mother as they set up the system to manage the Emperor's condition. General Haram, with the broad smile that he'd always worn when amusing the two princes as children, bouncing Ansul on his knee and entertaining Kabar with war stories. General Haram, who had gifted Kabar his first blade and taught him how to use it. Ansul haltingly asked if his brother killed Haram, and Biliath replied that he accused him of some made-up treason, found him guilty, and had her execute him. Ansul could scarcely breathe as he asked why, to which she explained that he wanted the only man who could challenge his power out of the way, and he wanted Tom Brat to be his victory and his victory alone, and because he's insane. He dragged his eyes away from Haram's mangled form as the other soldiers opened the other land crossers, quietly removing their cargo. More and more coffins, more and more bodies. Officers, soldiers, all dead, bodies charred and burnt and dirty, prosthetics torn away before being lovingly recovered and reattached, giving them some dignity in death. Hundreds of bodies, all draped in Biliath's standard. He turned to her, and her eyes were hard. She spat out that they were loyal soldiers, her soldiers, put to the sword, and Haram's blood is on her hands. Ansul tried to argue with her, but she cut him off, stating that she should have cut Kabar's throat when she had the chance. In her quiet fury, he couldn't even argue. Who could, confronted with this horror? He went silent, both of them watching the coffins be carried off the machines, and he realized why he didn't recognize the formation. It was a funeral procession. He looked down at Haram's ugly, mangled corpse, staring back at him. Biliath whispered to him that she wanted this to end without bloodshed. She really did, but this is too much. He didn't say anything, and she continued, saying that this blood is on his hands as well. He let this happen, just as she did. Haram's dead eyes pierced him, staring into his soul. Biliath tells him that blood needs to be paid in blood, and every drop of blood Kabar has in his body isn't enough to atone for this, but it's a start. Kabar's given the order that the bodies of traitors are not to enter Amoni-Ram. She's not leaving her men, and they'll stay here until the flesh rots and the bones turn to dust. She will not abandon them again. She turned to him, eyes incandescent with rage, jabbing a finger into his chest. Or he can do what he should have done ages ago, and admit what his brother has become. Hundreds of corpses, hundreds more soldiers refusing to abandon their comrades, expecting him to do something, to give an order, expecting him to rule. Ansul found himself stating that Kabar does not rule Amoni-Ram yet, so they should bury the dead in the cemeteries with full honors. The soldiers lumbered forth, lifting the coffins and beginning to carry them through the city gates. He looked to Biliath. She didn't look back at him. Ansul stumbled through the streets, mind adrift somewhere else. Biliath led in front of him. They were both cloaked again. She had sneaked him out of the apartment, but now it was the dead of night rather than the day. The spice markets were silent. There were no tea shops open. Even the hashish dens had quieted. The pair of them walked through the streets, utterly silent. He couldn't focus enough to ask where they were going. If he tried to think, his mind would flash with the image. Haram's dead, pale face, all blood drained, eyes popping out. His prosthetics sheared apart and his throat stained with his own blood. Killed by his brother. The phrase kept echoing through his head. Killed by his brother. All of those men, not just Haram. It bounced around his skull until he was gently pulled forward by Biliath, and he realized they were at the palace gates. He dropped his cloak, and the guards apologized for not recognizing him. He nodded absent-mindedly, and they let him through. Still holding his hand, Biliath led him across the courtyard, up the stairs into the palace, through the servant corridors, until they reached the side door and pushed into the throne room. He finally acknowledged the journey as she led him across the tile into the dais and sat him in the foulard throne. He let it happen. He hadn't sat on this throne since he was a child too small to realize what it signified. He asked her why they're here, and she replied simply that he needs to understand. She slipped a hand inside her breastplate, withdrawing a small, white ceramic cylinder marked with indentations and bumps. He dimly recognized it as belonging to his machine. She tells him that he's not going to understand unless he sees it for himself, and she places the cylinder into the slot on the throne's armrest, moving his hand into the depression. The throne began to click and grind from underneath him, and he was about to rise to his feet and shout, but then the throne room wasn't there anymore. Instead, he was standing on a field turned graveyard. This wasn't battle. These were endless corpses, stacked on top of one another, flies swarming the rotting flesh. They went on as far as the eye could see, stretching to the horizon, intermingling between Deva and Mechanite. The stench of death invaded his nostrils, his stomach turning. And then he found himself turning, eyes planted in someone else's body. Kabar, at the far end of the killing field, the brother he had not seen in so many years. He was older, his nose sharper, a darker, heavier air about him. Carried himself high even as the soldiers marched in front of him, dragging more bodies and flinging them into this interminable pit of death. There were thousands of corpses here, at the least. He felt his fists clench around the hilt of a sword, involuntarily, as Kabar smiled. Then he was in a battlefield, pressed prone to the ground, explosions overhead. Terror gripped his heart, the fires were blinding. He was pressed against a corpse, a mechanite whose head had been split in twain, his brains leaking out over Ansul's pauldron. They were smashed into the corner of this bridge, while other soldiers rushed headlong into the fray, screaming, firing their bolts. He couldn't move, he couldn't breathe, he could only watch, pressed between corpses, as a Deva tree beast tore out of the gate to the city, arms swinging, the sheer force of the swing eviscerating several soldiers. Then it cut to him standing behind Kabar on a hill, overlooking the charge, watching it fail, be repelled, the screaming, the shouting, watching his brother casually shrug in the face of such carnage, return to his tent and meal. And then he was in the body of his love, Biliath, sinking to her knees, watching his old uncle Haram twisting and writhing in the stone courtyard, screaming like a man possessed as he bled from every limb. Unable to intervene, casting a hopeless glance at Kabar, who was watching Haram die with satisfaction. No, glee on his face. Glee at a job well done, glee that his enemy was dead, glee that he had gotten away with this brazen lie. Sheer, manic excitement that no one would be able to stand in the way now, those golden eyes matching his. And then those golden eyes became the rich brown of a Deva boy, being dragged away from Kabar on a lead, and again being limply dragged by his neck from the back of Kabar's tent, bleeding all over, dead, and again lying twisted and splayed on so many other corpses, so many other victims. And then he screamed with the impossible weight of knowledge of what his brother had become, and it was over, and he was on his knees in front of the throne, and Biliath was helping him up, holding his shaking form as he pressed his forehead against her shoulder, panting. She asked if he saw it, and he nodded, still shaking. She stated that he knows what he has to do, but he replied that he doesn't know if he can. She helped him up, drawing a vial from her breastplate, corked, full of something white, and she pressed it into his hand. She said that she'd be with him through it all, but she's done all that she can. She can't help him, show him more than she has already. He asks how she brings herself to do these things, the visions of the battle fresh in his mind. She didn't answer for some time, but finally she managed to explain that you step away from your body and you let something else take over, something unburdened by honor or thought, and you let it do what needs to be done. He stared at the vial, filled with horrified uncertainty, and he asks if he does this, how much for it to be instant. Biliath thought about Haram's words. 1 drop, and the priestess had suffered for weeks. The full vial would have killed her instantly. And then she thought about Haram's dead face, no light behind his eyes, prosthetics torn apart, life and body destroyed for his cause. She finally replied, telling him 1 drop. He found himself leaving the throne room alone, letting his feet carry him. He tried not to think about what he'd agreed to, but his mind swirled with the visions, implacable. His brother with his sword held high above Haram's neck. His brother next to him in the pantries, feasting on sweets stolen from the kitchens. His brother watching, bored, as the bodies were carried out of his tent. His brother falling asleep by his bed when he had been stricken with fever as a child. He didn't bother with the servants' corridors, walking directly through the vast hallways and over the mosaics and tiles. The tapestries on the walls told stories he didn't pay attention to as he swept through the palace, through once familiar courtyards and halls and gardens, no destination in mind. The few courtiers and servants sunk into bows on seeing him, and he didn't care enough to tell them to rise. He'd run through these same hallways once, chasing his brother and being chased in turn, laughing, shouting, grabbing, and tackling. But that had been when they were children, before his father had taken to raising Kabar as an emperor ought to be raised. Before they had stopped playing together, and Kabar had spent more and more time in the garrison. Before he turned cruel and hard as he grew older, decrying his younger brother as a soft-shelled weakling. Before Ansul had left the palace at 16, so he wouldn't have to see what his brother was becoming. The sight of the hallways didn't bring back warm recollections anymore, just a sinking feeling, the pain of memories he didn't want to think about. He looked out over what was once a garden. The plants had been torn out now, but he still remembered the purple and gold flowers and the lush greenery surrounding them as a teenage Kabar rubbed dirt into a cut on his younger brother's knee. "Shush," he had said, "and not to cry, as their father will be upset." Ansul had stopped his sniffling immediately, eager to follow his brother's commands, but asked why. Kabar responded that father says weakness is for girls and cowards. He has to be strong, like an emperor. And from this angle, through his collar, the young Ansul's eyes saw the constellation of cuts and bruises and scars underneath Kabar's tunic. Some old and faded, most fresh. Reaching out to touch them as Kabar recoiled, shoving his dear brother backward into the dirt, snarling at him not to touch him. He straightened his tunic while Ansul watched, eyes wide, unable to excise the image of what he had seen. And then the memory was gone, and Ansul was a man again, sitting in the now bare gardens, and his head was in his hands, and he was crying bitter tears for the brother he had lost, and would never have again. Just before the sun rose, he found himself leaving the palace, wandering in a daze to the academy grounds. It was early in the morning, and most of the clerics were indisposed, so nobody was there to express their admiration or kneel. He was glad. He didn't think he would be able to handle it right now. He spread his robes, sitting on a bench across from Bumaro's tree as it caught the light of the rising sun. And between the glimmering gold and green leaves and the pale wood marbled with foulade, he saw the dark, creeping brown of the fungal rot on one of the branches, eating away just underneath the surface, no matter how perfect the leaves looked. It had gotten worse from his last visit, and now threatened to escape from this branch to the main trunk of the tree. He stared at it, at the thinning space between the rot and the trunk, until the sun fully rose and the clerics began arriving, casting sidelong glances at the seated prince. Eventually, one approached him, asking him if he was all right. The voice sounded distant, muffled, as though speaking through a blanket. Ansul kept staring at the tree, until finally his lips moved, telling him to shear it. They must cull the branch to save the tree. The cleric nodded, somewhat taken aback, and had it arranged post-haste. Ansul still sat, watching as another cleric arrived with a ladder and took a saw to the midpoint of the branch, cutting it away until it groaned and fell to the ground, exposing the interior flesh of the tree. It was rotting from the inside. It was a day of celebration in Amoni-Ram. The streets, usually busy, were now utterly packed. There was hardly room to squeeze between two people. Entire families were out, dressed in their finest clothing with freshly polished foulade, the women in newly done makeup and their hair prettied. The men had been released from their work for the day, save for the market men. They meandered through the crowds, exchanging grilled meats for coin. There was a buzz of excitement in the air, electric and pervasive. Like a lumbering wave, the crowd contracted towards the eastern gate, moving in slow motion. Normally, the walls of Amoni-Ram were off-limits to all but the guardsmen. Their restrictions had been slightly relaxed for the occasion. Nobles, merchants, the wealthy and influential found themselves lining the eastern portion of the wall, leaning against the battlements with their children, oohing and eyeing with excitement as the great cloud of dust approached from the distance. Eventually, it took form. A grand army, 20,000 men deep, stretching far into the horizon, throwing up sand as they marched. Land crossers moving foot by foot, legion soldiers with their golden arms and armor, imperial guards holding up the feathered standards of the Shahal, approaching steadily closer to Amoni-Ram. When they grew close enough to make out the figure leading them, another wave of excitement shot through the crowds on the walls, and from there to the masses in the streets. And eventually, more whispers began to pass through the crowd, followed quickly by shouts and calls to move, to back away. The sea of people parted to allow the passage of the Prince of Amoni-Ram and his imperial guards, bearing the standard of the city. They sank into deep kneels, for today was a day of great respect for the dynasty. Ansul let himself be carried along, like a bird on the desert currents, his mind lost elsewhere. He was in his finest robes, imported and hand-stitched, intricate tailoring and gilding with real foulade. General Malene was to his right, Biliath was to his left. He wished he could reach out and squeeze her hand. They marched forward, surrounded by a circle of Imperial guardsmen, until they reached the open plaza before the eastern gate. Malin whispered to him that they wait for his order, and Ansul nodded. His legs felt shaky. Had he eaten since last night? He dismissed the thought, and raised his voice past the hoarseness into a shout, commanding them to open the gate. The guardsmen heard him and repeated the shout, and the guards on the wall repeated it again, and soon 100 men were echoing the command. The pumps sprung to life, rumbling as they pulled the chains back, moving the massive gates back on their rails. The army marched in, to wild screams and cheers. The landcrossers pushed in, surrounded by officers carrying armfuls of looted treasures, Deva statues, artworks, weapons, shields, richly decorated suits of armor, woven robes from their priestesses. Huge strings of petrified wood charms dangled from their necks as Amoni-Ram roared in triumph and approval for her returning sons. And then the soldiers parted. The crowd sunk into a deep bow in a wave from front to back, and Ansul laid eyes on his brother, Kabar, clad in fine gilded armor, riding a chestnut stallion into the plaza. He dismounted, raising a hand to quell the cheers from the people, before approaching Ansul, the only one not kneeling. They embraced, Kabar's armor digging into his skin. Ansul kissed both of his cheeks, no joy in his eyes. The two were in the Court of Lions, blessedly alone, as Ansul tells his brother that he looks well. The parade had taken most of the day, the pair of them riding on twin horses in a spiral through Amoni-Ram, slowly approaching the palace. Ansul's back was drenched in sweat. Kabar was little better, so they both sat on the expensive chaises and cushions, staining them, uncaring. Kabar smiled and replied that he is well. These victories have brought honor to his name, to their name. Ansul nodded, leaning back. It was strange. His brother's face was at once familiar and unfamiliar. Not the same face he had borne when he had left so many years ago, but Ansul had seen this new, sharp, hard face in Biliath's memories. It was like recognizing something from a dream. Kabar asked him if he had something on his face, but Ansul just apologized. Kabar replied that he must look haggard after so many months on the battlefield, but Ansul told him that he looks fine actually, and his hair is still cut short. Kabar explained that he had an attendant do that before he arrived, but Ansul peered into his memories, into Biliath's memories. Kabar's short hair, trimmed ever so neat by attendants with golden shears, while his soldiers had their beards matted with dirt and blood and grime. Kabar continued, stating that he'll have the attendants here handle it before the coronation, and Ansul's breath caught in his throat. He remarked that he must be excited, but Kabar just shrugged, stating that he takes no joy in assuming the throne, as it's just duty. And before he could stop it, the vision passed through Ansul's head, of Kabar holding a sword over the neck of the only man standing in his way to the throne, of his golden eyes alight with the sheer glee of it all. His stomach turned. The same golden eyes he had, the same golden eyes that had looked on in concern when he had broken a bone as a child, that had matched his gaze while rubbing dirt into his wounds. The eyes of a murderer, of a madman. Ansul asks if it's not better to wait, perhaps, causing Kabar to lean forward, asking why he would wait. Ansul fidgeted, hands tying themselves into knots while the pit in his stomach expanded. He ventured that, with this news about Haram, people might want time to process it, but Kabar cut him off, telling him not to take that traitor's name. Ansul replies that he still can't believe it, as he bounced them on his knee as boys. He served the Legion faithfully in the East. He doesn't know why Haram would turn traitor now. Kabar just shrugged and remarks that who can say why a coward does what he does? Ansul hesitates before asking if Kabar is absolutely sure that he was a traitor. Kabar replies that he wrested the admission from the lips of a Deva assassin sent to cut him in his sleep, who had given up Haram by name. Ansul lowered his face into his hands to avoid showing his own eyes, lest his brother see the fury in them. Even clasped in darkness, all he could see was Haram's face, rendered in bloody detail in Biliath's lap. Gurgling, choking on his own blood, begging for the sweet mercy of death. And then again, cold and lifeless in a casket carried from Tom Brat, the Legion's most honored warrior. He should have come home to the hero's welcome Kabar received. Instead, he came home in a casket. Ansul forced his fists to relax and rose to his feet, muscles outside his control carrying him to the cart in the corner of the room. The presence of the vial and a string around his neck weighed more than any load. Hands shaking, he raised the pot, pouring the tea into 2 ceramic cups, and asked Kabar what his plans were after the coronation. Kabar looked to the painted ceiling, decorated richly with murals of past kings and absent gods. He didn't notice his brother unlooping something from around his neck, and mused that he can't say he's too sure, in all honesty, but he'll have to marry, obviously. Ansul asked him flatly and emotionlessly if he intends to follow tradition in that regard. He rolled the small vial between 2 fingers, watching the liquid flow, fingers uncertain, hesitating. Kabar supposes that he does, but remarks that Biliath isn't fit to be an empress, although she'll make a fine toy in his harem for a few years. He grinned at his brother, commenting that they're uncouth thoughts maybe, but asks if his brother can blame him. Ansul's fist tightened. His breathing slowed, and time slowed with it. He reached up, uncorked the vial, and tipped it, letting a single drop slip into the tea. Then it was gone again, slipped into a pocket of his robes, and he was serving the tea for the both of them, and watching his brother lift the cup, and drinking from it, and then it was an hour later, and Ansul was doubled over in the courtyard, one hand on the wall as he vomited into the flower bed, eyes wide and bloodshot with the weight of what he'd done. And Biliath was next to him, holding his hair back, holding his shoulder as he collapsed into heaving, racking sobs. It took 6 days for Kabar to die. On the first day, he grew suddenly ill, and the feast in his honor at the palace was postponed. He waved a hand, assuring Helena that he was quite fine, quite prepared for the ceremonies tomorrow, before retiring to his quarters. Sickness from the long journey, from the shock of returning home. On the second day, his attendants found him in the morning, white sheets stained with red. He was on his knees on the balcony, head through the bars of the railing, vomiting blood into the courtyard below. With what words he could make out, he insisted that he was fine, that the sweat matting his hair was nothing. On the third day, the healers and alchemists came, rushed from across Amoni-Ram to treat the ailing prince. The finest minds of Amoni-Ram brought their concoctions, their tinctures, poultices, and potions, and the terrified empress held her son's head up from his pillows while he struggled to sip what the healers promised would cure whatever he had been stricken with. On the fourth day, the true pain began. He bled into his eyes, rendering him blind, and his nose gushed more freely. He became weak and unable to move without assistance from his attendants or his now weeping mother. Not that he did, lying writhing in bed with agony. He couldn't form the words to say where it was coming from, just laying with his back arching and his lungs screaming until they were dry. The sheets twisted around his legs, and he drenched himself in his own sweat and urine. On the 5th day, he received a visitor. He had been moved from his chambers to a more secluded, private, and open wing of the palace, with the hope the fresh air would help him. Healers and servants milled about, unwilling to open the doors to his chambers, the muffled screaming audible just beyond it. They caught sight of the prince's twisting form as the visitor opened the door to enter, and then it was closed again. His visitor took a seat in the chair by his bed, and waited patiently. It took a few minutes, but eventually the miasma of pain wore away, and Kabar's hands groped his way across the bed to feel the prosthetics of his visitor. He gasped out in surprise that Biliath came to him and bid her to come closer. He half hissed it, hands scrabbling up to her arm and blindly pulling her close. He says that she's always been loyal to him, to her master. The healers can do nothing, and this is no natural illness. He cut himself off again as another blinding hot flash of pain made all of his muscles arch. He groaned through gritted teeth as it passed and his body relaxed. He states that he must have been poisoned, and she asks if he'd like her to fetch the guards. He shook his head wildly, not looking at her. With his shirt off, she could see a constellation of scars and unhealed burns across his chest. She idly wondered where they came from on a boy raised in such luxury before dismissing the thought. He laughed, throat hoarse, stating that it's too late and he's dying. Haram's last laugh, maybe, that insipid, traitorous wretch. Then he pulled her closer yet, blind eyes focusing on nothing, and told her that she must protect Ansul for him. The dynasty cannot die, and the empire cannot die with him, so she must protect Ansul. It took a moment for her to bite back the bile and answer, telling him that she will. Then she leaned closer and began stating names. She went on for minutes, naming the names seared into her memory, Fulad fingers wrapped tightly around Kabar's arm, staring into his blind, pathetic, terrified eyes while reciting the names of the 200 dead laid to fitful rest in Amoni-Ram's graveyards. She finished with Haram's name, and then he heard her rising to her feet. He whimpered for her to not leave him alone, but nobody answered. On the 6th day, Kabar Bumaro, Shahal, Crown Prince of Amoni-Ram, heir to the Fulad throne, died. The Imperial Guard flanked Ansul as he stared off into the distance. In front of him, the clerics waved their incense censers, herbs burning, smoke rising into the sky of Amoni-Ram. His mother was leaning on his shoulder in her black veils, weeping openly, sobbing just quiet enough not to be heard under the chanting from the clerics. They read from the old texts, the first prayers, when Bumaro I was laid to rest by his son. In some dim part of his mind, Ansul appreciated the irony. There were thousands of people attending the funeral, outside the palace gates, clutching each other, weeping, sobbing prayers for their lost prince, felled by disease just after single-handedly wresting the jewel from the crown of the Deva. The vile work of their priestesses, no doubt. Vengeance would come eventually, but today was a day of mourning. The inner party was inside the courtyard, in the Court of Swords, where generations of the Bumaros were interred in neat, simple rows. A different Fulad sword speared into the dirt of each grave, an old tradition. They had no need for their weapons anymore, after all. His mother continued to weep as the prayers drew to a close, the 3 clerics circling the empty grave retreating to the rest of the crowd. Malene was there, all the high clerics, shahs, and governors that could arrive in time. Biliath was by his side, wings folded. eyes low, heads hung. A few cried as the coffin was carried out by the Imperial Guard and placed into the grave. Most didn't. Finally, as the foulard casket was placed inside and the dirt was filled over, the High Cleric looked to Ansul. He moved robotically, without thought or consideration. Stepping forward, grasping Kabar's sword, kneeling before the grave, and then spearing it into the dirt. There were no words to say. Nothing that could absolve him of this. His mother's sobbing was the only sound in the courtyard now. The cleric gingerly touched his shoulder. He barely felt it, as the cleric told him that it's time, and the Emperor is waiting. The door to the throne room slammed heavily behind him. The Imperial Guard were stationed outside, sealing the entrance. In the vast, magnificent hall, he was alone now. Except for his father. He was lounging on that same chaise, now placed just in front of the throne. Eyes milky, unfocused, sucking in wheezing breaths, draped in the finest silk robes and jewelry from across the empire he had once ruled with an iron fist. Ansul approached, heels clicking against the tile. There were no guards in the hall. No one to judge, but he still felt compelled to sink into a kneel for this dying man. Not that his father would ever notice. The sucking breaths didn't so much as skip a beat. But Ansul did regardless, kneeling at the side of the chaise, where his father's hand dangled limp. He told him that Kabar is dead, and he is his only heir now. He is to abdicate, as he always promised, and should grant him the throne to rule. With no response other than sucking and wheezing, Ansul looked up. The rasping breaths echoed out through the hall, and his eyelids were lowered. Ansul remarks that he's not going to do that, because he can't. He has no throne to abdicate. In spite of himself, looking at this husk of a man, Ansul felt rage well up. He's not a ruler. He's not even alive. This diseased old thing, more machine than man, mechanically clinging to life. This figure had once ruled and dominated the palace, ruled and dominated him. Ansul told him that he's responsible for all of this, for Kabar's killing. He made Kabar into himself, as his father did to him, all too eager to mark the same bruises. His hands shook with blind, red-hot rage. He snatched out, ringed finger hooking around his father's sheer robe and pulling it away, exposing his chest. Almost completely machinery, wires and pipes poking into and under his skin, keeping his blood warm and pumping. Sucking pumps keeping his kidneys filtering and his liver alive. What little flesh there still was dominated by cuts, age-old burns, scars older than his son was. His lip hung lazily, drool collecting at the tip. Ansul's voice shook as he called him a miserable old bastard and stated that he never wanted this. He never wanted any of this, but he made it so. It's the only thing he's capable of, taking and ruining other people, making them what he wants. His mother, Kabar, and him. Ansul's lip curled, and he moved without even really being aware of what he was doing, fingers dancing across his father's chest, flicking switches, pulling out pumps and cables. He spat that he brought him to this, him and the rest of this damned dynasty. Ansul takes, and he cannot be certain it is for the right reasons, and not simply because he made him this way. Not simply because Ansul wanted what Kabar had, because this cursed blood infests him. Fluid spilled, the rhythm was disrupted, and then everything was being yanked out or smashed, crushed until it shorted and died, and the Emperor's breathing was erratic, and Ansul's hands were still moving, bitter tears in his hardened eyes. A hand wrapped around his wrist, and he looked up in shock. Haith's fingers suddenly possessed with an iron grip, locking Ansul's movements. Ansul gasped, trying to pull away fruitlessly, but he couldn't. This was the strength of the dying. His father's mouth hung open, dead silent, but the milkiness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a sputtering golden, the dying embers of a once great fire. With a wrench, the son pulled away and fell backward heavily. He lay sprawled on the tile, staring up, his father's gaunt, sunken appearance boring into him. The two of them said nothing, staring at one another. Then Haith raised one long, bony finger, pointing it dead at his son, face aghast, golden eyes peering at what awaited him in the next life. A whisper escaped his lips, calling him his son. Ansul scarcely dared to breathe, but said that yes, it's him. Haith, however, called him Kabar, his son, and in shock, Ansul's gaze matched his father's. In that moment, two pairs of golden eyes staring at each other across the throne room, Ansul saw a mirror. A revenant, empire incarnate, a blood-soaked dynasty as old as Amoni-Ram itself. The same golden eyes buried in his own skull. And with that, Haith Bumaro, Emperor of the Broken Empire, Lord of the Fulad Throne, shuddered and died. Biliath lay in her cot, staring at the sandstone ceiling. It had been a few days since the Emperor's death. Ansul had left the throne room, visibly shaken. The Imperial Guard collected the body. They had known this was going to happen. They had merely expected Kabar to be the one to do it. They had knelt when Ansul exited, his robe dragging behind him, greeting him not as prince, but as emperor, sovereign of all Amoni-Ram. She had been there, seen the shock on his face, seen his faraway eyes, lost in a different place while he let his body do what needed to be done. She was familiar with the experience, but his face had been so empty. His proper coronation was not for a few days. A noise roused her from staring at the ceiling. She sat up. She was in her room in the garrison, really only for sleeping, so no one would ask where she was laying her head at night. Most of her things had been moved into it for the time being, at least until the coronation. It was the forest beasts. She had almost forgotten about them. The small, wood-woven cage containing the little creatures. They were her little secret. She approached the cage. One of the forest beasts was eating one of the others. For a moment, she thought it was the one she had given the poison to, but no, that one had been the bully of the litter. Fat, white skin, with turquoise stripes along its back. This one was leaner, with a shelling pattern. She remembered it. It had been meek and timid, toadying to its brother. And now here it was, choking down one of its smaller brothers almost whole, pinkish blood staining the stones around them. She stared at it, frowning, unable to move. Ansul stared at the man in the mirror, unrecognizing. This wasn't him. He didn't live in the palace. He didn't wear gems and jewels. He certainly didn't wear these robes, gilded and intricate and as long as 3 men, dragging along the tile floors. He wasn't a king. But here he stood, the man in the mirror looking back at him. He heard a noise and turned. The door opened, and in the half-second it did, he could hear the outside. The Imperial guards holding the door, preparing to escort him to the throne room. The nobles and dignitaries and courtiers and generals and governors all milling about, chatting with each other, counting themselves lucky to witness a new coronation in Amoni-Ram within their lifetime. Then the door closed again, and Biliath was standing there. She approached. The two greeted one another, and Biliath told him that everyone's waiting. He returned to staring in the mirror as Biliath came up to his side. Her own armor was freshly polished and the fabric repaired from the damage it had taken in battle. Her sword hung by her side. He tells her that this wasn't how he ever thought it would be, and she agrees. He asks if it had to happen this quickly, to which she replies that the clerics don't want to leave any gap in succession. Kabar's death has startled them. Ansul ponders his death, how casual it was, and how attributable it was as an act of nature. He asks her how you can be sure you did the right thing for the right reasons. She asks, in turn, if there are wrong reasons, and he looked at her, imagining her stripped of her finery, locked away in Kabar's Haram house, never to see him again. He replies that there are always wrong reasons, and she thought about it for some time before saying that she doesn't know, but they did it, and now it's over. He looked at his hand, looked at the signet ring on his finger, the ring marking him as the Shahal, the ring that was his brother's for so many years. He remarks that he will never be forgiven for it, and he will never forgive himself for it. She tells him that he had to, and he knows that as well as she does, as well as anyone. War makes bastards of us all. She didn't expect him to twirl around, grab her shoulder, crazed look in his eyes, as he shouts that no, there is honor in war. There is no honor in this, raising the ring. War didn't make him do this. There is a demon, a devil in his blood, in Kabar's blood, in their father's blood, in his father's blood, in his son's one day, no doubt. His mother was right. Bumaros take and they ruin. They take and they ruin lives. His voice was strangled, pleading, as he says that there is no escaping this cursed dynasty. He is a prisoner to it, and she is a prisoner to it. She wrapped her fingers around his wrist, but said nothing, and he continued, saying that war doesn't turn them into bastards. This wretched empire does. Biliath brought up her other hand, supporting him as he sank into a chair. She spoke again, stating that it stands regardless, and as long as it stands, someone will lead it. It could have been Kabar, but it will be him, and he will rule with the finest of intentions. Ansul just replies that his father did as well, and then he didn't say anything for quite some time. Eventually he tells Biliath that if he ever becomes like them, monsters, inhuman, rotten by that damned throne, he wants her to cut his throat in the night. This is the nature of this empire. No one will control him. He looked at her, golden gaze matching hers, and says that he needs her to swear it, or they'll leave right now, riding into the desert, and leave this corroding city behind. He needs her to swear that she has it in her to kill him, just as he killed Kabar, when the time comes. She hesitates, but swears, and her wing didn't twitch. He then says that he has no one left, with his father, Kabar, and Haram all gone. Biliath replies that he has her, and will always have her. He sagged into her, as the two promised each other that they are theirs. She helped him to his feet, and Ansul Bumaro, sovereign of Amoni-Ram, emperor of the Broken Empire, lord of the Fulad throne, opened the door.